Thanks for coming. Since this is an international forum, I would like to just start off by giving thanks to Dr. Fred Hatfield, who gave me a big opportunity about 10 years ago. And they always say that luck is where preparation meets opportunity. And I was somebody in 1991 who was prepared and needed an opportunity. And Dr. Hatfield actually gave me that opportunity. So for those of you who felt that you've benefited from my work, Dr. Hatfield is partly responsible for that. So I just wanted to bring that up first. How many people here are working with clients in a professional realm? In other words, you're not here for your own information, but that you actually work either in a fitness or conditioning type realm. Okay. Interestingly enough, I have an interesting career assessment for you that I'll just start off with, which is that what you do is you ask yourself a question: if you were to win the lottery tomorrow, how much would it change your life? And the less that it would change your life, the more of it's a sign that you're in the right career path. So your career should really feel effortless for you. You should feel compelled to do what you do. And if not, if there's any sort of sense of struggle, I think that's a sign that possibly you're not in the right field. So we'll just open up with that. How many people actually are working with combat athletes on one level or another? Martial artists, boxers. Okay, how many people are martial artists or boxers or in that realm? Okay, very good. There's a very important distinction that you make with combat athletes versus other types of athletes. And the distinction is that as a whole, combat athletes are the most resistant group of athletes to strength training that you can find. It's sort of an interesting paradox. And what it revolves around is that because if you look at the martial arts traditions that go back through eons, what you find is that there was an emphasis on technique. There's an emphasis on being able to win an encounter with somebody bigger than you because you're using better technique, correct? So what happens subconsciously, or maybe it's sometimes consciously, but whether it's subconscious or conscious, there is the assumption that when you recommend strength training, that you are asking them to cheat on a certain level. So I really feel that that's what's behind the resistance that martial arts athletes have in terms of strength training. There are a couple of strategies that you can use to kind of get past that initially. The first thing is you should never refer to yourself as a strength coach, because you're setting yourself up to failure right off the bat. Incidentally, the harder it is to describe what you do to people, the better your career choice was, in my sense of things. Okay, so in lay people's terms, what I am is a strength coach. In reality, it's a physical preparation specialist. So don't use the word strength coach when you're talking to a martial arts athlete, because you're setting yourself up for a failure. Call yourself a physical preparation specialist. Call yourself a consultant. Whatever it is that you want to say, but don't use the word strength coach. Another concept that you can do in terms of an analogy, if you are trying to convince an athlete that there is a need for strength training, is you just say, look, if you were to take the best women's tennis player in the world and pit her against the best male tennis player in the world, who wins? And the answer is the best male tennis player in the world, and it's not because there's anything inherently superior about being male, it's just simply that the male is stronger. So there is a need for strength, and you really do need to make the analogy that, for two athletes of equal technical ability, equal tactical ability, equal psychological preparation, the person who has the better physical preparation is going to come out the victor. So those are some strategies that I think are useful in terms of talking to martial artists. There are two key points to my training system. The first is the application of project management principles to the realm of training. And the second is a redefinition of what I would call quality in terms of resistance training. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is project management. This conference, by the way, is amazing in terms of how well this is put together. And if you look at it, putting together the Swiss conference is a project. It's the application of resources towards the accomplishment of a goal. the reason that I think project management principles are useful in strength training is that strength training research is problematic on a couple of important levels. The first level is that most of the best strength training research comes from Soviet bloc countries. And the problem with that is, A, you don't know if they're telling you the truth, and B, if that strength training system is not preserved in the context of that socioeconomic political system, then you have to wonder if you can get the same results when you put it into a different system, so to speak. Okay? So that's one problem in terms of strength training research. The second problem is that, for example, one set to failure, multiple sets. Which is better? The research is split right down the middle on it. Whatever your pet strength training theory is, you can find research to support it. When you see something like that in the literature, it has to make you wonder how reliable it is. And research, for example, is more useful in the field of nutrition, in my mind, than it is in strength training. So I think you do have to be on top of the research, but the research is problematic. If you look at machines versus free weights, high reps versus low reps, you can find support for all of these ideas, so that can be problematic. The definition of a project is a non-routine series of tasks directed toward the accomplishment of a goal. And if you look at how well the science of project management has been developed over years and years of business application, what you find is that it's really at a very refined state. So what I tried to do is I tried to look at these principles and to see how they could be applied to athletes. Okay? So, for example, when you've got a lot at stake, when there's a lot on the line, for example, when Boeing was building the 777, there was a lot at stake. There were a lot of resources at stake. There are potentially lives on the line. So the principles that are used to develop the science behind allocating those resources, when there's a lot at stake like this, then in my mind, it's on certain levels a better sort of situation here. So here's what we're going to do. This form, by the way, if you want to give me your email address, we're going to back up here once after my presentation here. If you get me your email address, I will give you these forms in PDF format. Now, what you're not seeing here is that on each line you have a task. So this was put as an EPS, so it's not quite legible, but you've got a task and you've got an underlying assumption. So in other words, when I'm creating a training program for an athlete, what I'm doing is I've got a list of tasks. So, and we've got ABC referring to priority. We've got a start date, we have a target finish, we have an actual finish, and we have means and methods. I'll give you an example of how this can work in terms of a practical scenario. I was preparing an athlete this past summer for the U.S. Women's Olympic bobsled team. And when we did initial assessments on this woman, we found that her hamstrings were extremely long, and yet when you check the length of the antagonist, the rectus femoris in this case, she had absolutely no length in the rectus femoris. In other words, in a prone test where you're trying to pick the knee up off the floor, 0 degrees of extension, where most physical therapists would tell you you want like in the neighborhood of 30 degrees, okay? So one of my governing principles as a physical preparation specialist is that when you see huge discrepancies between agonist and antagonist, that's something that you've got to get after. So looking back here, the underlying assumption is that if we can improve the discrepancy between the agonist and the antagonist, then we should get a better result in terms of her goal. And let me just step back for a second here. We've got up here the project definition. What I do is I sit down with the athlete, and in this case, what we said is, what is your goal? What is it that you would like to accomplish? And she said, well, I want to get on the bobsled team. And I said, well, that is your goal, but it's not our goal. And what is the problem with that as a goal in terms of what we're trying to do? If you've got a fighter and their goal is to make it to the next Ultimate Fighting Championship, championships, or if you've got somebody who wants to win the heavyweight title in professional boxing. What is the problem with that type of a goal? Scott?
The decision part of it is out of their control. They're being selected.
Correct. You do not have control over that outcome. So in the case of this female bobsledder, what we did, or she wasn't a bobsledder yet, but what we did in this case is we said, well, let's construct a goal that you and I can work on that will relate to better performance, but we have better control over. And so we came up with the fact that she wanted to go to the tryouts with a 230-pound power clean. So her lifetime best power clean was 215 pounds. This girl, by the way, weighs 145 pounds, so she's got pretty good tools to work with right from the start. So we do the assessments. We want to get this 230-pound power clean. And so the task, or the project definition is 230-pound power clean. In this particular case, I had 2 weeks to accomplish this. However, I saw a huge discrepancy in the length of the agonist-antagonist balance. Okay, so we've got the underlying assumption that the clean will improve if we can improve the length of the hip flexors, because there's so much hamstring involved in that power clean movement that if the majority of that hamstring strength is used towards fighting off that hip flexor, you don't have that much left for the lift. Okay, so that's the underlying assumption. The task was a particular form of stretching that we used for the rectus femoris. To make a long story short, what we did is we stretched the rectus femoris only. This was a single task. Now, we had a few other tasks as well, but this was our major priority. We stretched the rectus femoris 2 hours a day, 7 days a week for 12 days. And at least in this case, and this isn't to say that you get this kind of a result every single time, but she did, in fact, in 13 days, power clean 230 pounds, which was a 15-pound improvement off her lifetime best. So this is an example of how your tasks should be linked to an underlying assumption, which should be then linked to your core values as a practitioner. Now, this is a project evaluation sheet. So here's what you do in this case. The project is done. You have the client go through here. How well did the results meet the expected results? How achievable or realistic was the original plan? How well did we implement the plan? How well did we revise and update the plan? Were the necessary resources available? So forth and so on. Then you have the athlete sign off on this evaluation form, and a couple of very important things happen. The one thing that happens is the athlete walks away and says, we did it. And the other thing that happens is now you have data for yourself so that you can now say, all right, 94% effective or whatever the rate is, okay? So my whole point in this is saying that rather than taking a program approach, which kind of implies like an endless kind of thing where you're training somebody forever, goals are better if they are framed in kind of finite time periods, correct? So you have this finite time period, you have a clear objective for that time period, you implement the plan, you have the person sign off after it's done, and so this way you've got things that are a little bit more controllable. Okay, now, there is something called a productivity pyramid. Very kind of useful thing to do. I don't know if you've ever heard of it's kind of a hackneyed, cliched sort of saying, but there's a saying out there that I first saw in a realtor's office one time, and it said, stress is when your actions are inconsistent with your values. Okay, so this is project management lingo, so to speak, for personal organization. You have your underlying values. You have your long-term goals, which are broken down into short-term goals, which are broken down into your to-dos. If your to-dos are not consistent with your underlying values, you have stress in your life. Follow? For example, if you buy a house and you end up getting a home equity loan to put a pool in that house, and yet if one of your underlying values is financial independence, then now your actions are not consistent with your goals, and now you have stress. Okay? So what we can do is we can take this productivity pyramid and we can sort of shift it over into a realm that we can use this in terms of training. So the values now become your governing principles. Okay, long-term goals, you can think of that as like a macrocyclic view in terms of periodization. The short-term goals you can think of as a mesocyclic or a microcyclic type view. And the components or the to-dos are training sessions. Make sense so far? Now, this whole scenario requires that you have governing principles to start with. And I wonder how many people here have taken the time as a practitioner to make a list, a hierarchical list of your governing principles as a strength coach or as a therapist or whatever it is that you do. It's an important exercise to go through in my mind. Okay? And you know, this becomes basically a guide for decision making. Here's an example of a governing principle. Injury prevention is more important than performance enhancement. The first person I ever saw to say that was Ian King, and I looked at that and I thought, you know what? That is a hard concept to argue with. Okay? Another governing principle is you get the most bang for the buck in your training if you go after areas of weakness. You look for weak links. Do you follow what I mean? So I really strongly think that one of the most important things you can possibly do as a professional, here we come, now we're coming back, is to really sort of define those principles for yourself. And also as a human being, to define what are your governing principles. People are surprised that I don't have this massive training system. A training center. And the reason I don't have a massive training center is because one of my governing values as a human being is I don't want to be a slave to my business. I'm not in this to be working 80 hours a week. I'm in this to learn and to share with people and to spread ideas and to create and so forth. So that's an important thing to do. Okay, here is the Staley concept on prioritization. You focus your efforts on training elements which are A, needed, B, poorly developed, C, highly trainable, and D, foundational, given available resources. In other words, focus on weak links. I was working with a heptathlete last year who came to me because she was, you know, and all of you probably have the experience where athletes come to you as like a last resort instead of the first resort, okay? So that's the story of my whole life with athletes. But so she's coming to me with all sorts of orthopedic injuries. She's really, really busted up. She's actually avulsed both quadriceps off the kneecaps, plantar fascia surgery, herniated cervical and lumbar disc, you know, all these kinds of things. And she was working with a strength coach who was having her doing 95% squats, 90% clean and jerks, 95% military presses, and so forth and so on. And the problem is, if you have orthopedic injuries, those types of lifts will find them. So what we did during the initial assessment with this athlete is I said, okay, who is the best athlete in your sport? And she said, well, Jackie Joyner-Kersee. So I said, how strong are you compared to Jackie Joyner-Kersee? And she goes, well, you name the lift and I can beat her in it. You know, I clean more than her, I squat more than her, I bench press more than her, I have a higher vertical jump, I have a higher, longer standing broad jump, et cetera, et cetera. So then you have to ask yourself, why would a strength coach take the risks that are involved with that kind of loading when strength is not the issue at all? So again, you focus on what is needed but poorly developed. The mistake that this person made was that the maximal strength was needed, but it was not poorly developed. It was well developed. Okay? This is the SMART paradigm for goal orientation. My interest is not necessarily in teaching things that are unique, but teaching things that work. And it is really, really critical in my mind that you have good skills in terms of goal orientation. And the SMART model is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time referenced. The other element of this that's very important, and the reason that most people don't accomplish their goals, is that goals should be framed around behaviors and not outcomes. If you leave this seminar with anything, this is what I would like it to be. Frame goals around behaviors and not outcomes. I'll give you an example in my own personal training. I had been trying to power clean 275 pounds for like years. I was stuck at like 265 pounds since like 1989, you know? So every year I'm developing a program, as strength coaches like to do, develop programs and so forth, and it never happened, never happened, never happened, never happened. And I was developing a problem in my right wrist in terms of racking that bar on the shoulder, okay? And this is what was preventing me from achieving this claim. Well, I've got a friend who does coaching programs for business professionals and executives, and he's got a concept. He's the one who showed me this concept. His name is Jeff Smith. Showed me this concept about basing goals around behaviors. And so what I did is, instead of having the goal of a 275-pound power clean, I developed goals around 3 very specific behaviors. The first goal was, don't train when you're in pain. Revolutionary concept. Okay? Second goal was to ice the wrist every single time that I did an upper body resistance training session. And the third goal was something I learned from my chiropractor, Dr. Franco Colombo, who suggested to me that when you're in Olympic lifting, when you're in this position a lot, and this is sort of obvious, but your wrist flexors get kind of stretched out and they lose their strength, they lose their ability to protect the joint. So he suggested a regimen of wrist flexions. So those were the 3 goals. Within 3 months, I power cleaned 275. So it really is a powerful kind of idea to frame goals around behaviors instead of outcomes. In terms of planning, if you have a time frame, in other words, if you have a martial artist who has a specific competition at a specific date, then what you do is you use backward planning because you know how much time you've got. If, on the other hand, this is an ongoing type situation, you don't have a target competition date, then you use forward planning. So that also comes from project management principles. I'm going to skip ahead here to this, and then we'll come back to the dependent versus codependent tasks. Who knows what a Gantt chart is? Hands? All right, a Gantt chart is, if you go back to this project management map, you have a list of tasks, and then you have a timeline. Once I describe this to you, I think you'll probably recognize what I'm talking about. You have a timeline, so you've got the task. You've got like a triangle, for example, and then the triangle indicates the start of the project date for that time. You've got the timeline. Once the triangle is filled in, that means it's finished. You've got different symbols for dependent tasks and non-dependent tasks. I actually use Gantt charts for periodization. So that's something that is worth looking at. There are actually software programs out there that can do this for you as well. Okay? All right. I use a different definition of quality for resistance training than most people do, and I'm going to set up an analogy for you guys so that you guys can build the argument for me. I want you to imagine yourself doing a set of pull-ups to failure. And my question for you is this. Assuming that you know how to do a pull-up and that your technique for a pull-up is well established, the question is, what deteriorates first, your speed or your technique? Imagine yourself doing it. Who votes for speed? Okay, you follow what I mean? So in other words, you're doing the pull-up, you're getting slower, 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 and then at some point you start doing some funky biomechanics to continue to get the pull-ups. Everybody's comfortable with that? Assuming that your technique is stable. Beginners can be a different situation. Okay, now, second question. Do you agree that your training should be kept at a high level of quality? Any problems with that concept? Okay. So here's the premise. And I'm sorry that the AV problems here are a little bit distracting. If you agree that training should be kept at a high level of quality, and if you agree that speed deteriorates before your technical breakdown, then guess what that leaves you with? What is quality? Speed. Speed is quality, not technical breakdown, if you have a training background. Now, this is really an extremely different way to think about resistance training. But I'm going to set this up with a couple of analogies for you folks so that you can get a sense of this. I was teaching at a place called the Parisi School in Fair Lawn, New Jersey last weekend. And this particular facility coaches NFL football players for the combines. And one of the things that they do is they teach sprinting biomechanics. So they actually have a 60-meter Mondo track, 5-lane track, and they've got electronic timing on this track. So what I said to the coaches at the Parisi School is I said, assuming that somebody's sprint technique is in place, how much of a problem would it be if you had no way to time their sprints? And what they basically said to me is they said it would be monumental. There almost would be no point in even doing it. Well, to me, the same thing applies to resistance training. Okay? We're going to continue to develop this here. Do I have you thinking yet? A couple of things that are interesting with regards to using speed as your hallmark for quality instead of technical breakdown. The first thing is that you are focusing more on speed than load. You have to keep something in mind. The training effect is the byproduct of load times speed. Everybody follows? So in other words, the tension that goes through your system is load times the velocity of the load. However, for whatever reason, in resistance training, at least the way that I see everybody do this, our focus is on load, 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 load. The whole focus is on load, 100% focus on load, no focus on speed whatsoever. So the first benefit is that if the focus is on speed, this allows you to use somewhat lighter loads, and you have a safety component involved in this because you are never now in a situation where you're going to get trapped under a bar. Second benefit, and this is a really important benefit, is that when your efforts are focused on speed, you now have a feedback mechanism. Resistance training is motor learning, essentially. And by the way, I thought it was very interesting, the Parisi School, it's called the Parisi School of Strength, Speed, and Power. It's not called a gym or a training center. Very interesting how language affects the way that we think about things. In this country, training centers are called training centers or gyms. In the East Bloc, they were called schools, and workouts were called lessons. So the language element of this, I think, is very interesting. I'll give you an example of something. Anybody here ever do medicine ball drills for distance, and you're trying to improve your best throws, or doing something similar to that? Anybody here ever throw implements in track and field, discus, shot put, those sorts of things? Okay. So you're out there and you're trying to improve your best throw. And for example, throwing in track and field is a paradoxical kind of thing, because when you got something in your hand, all of your sort of focus is on this. And to get a successful throw, your focus needs to be on leg drive. So it's kind of a counter-intuitive thing to learn. So you're trying to beat your best throw, and so you start thinking of the biomechanics and the things that you can do technically to improve that throw. So you start thinking, okay, leg drive, separation, so forth. You get a longer throw, and it's like, feedback. I learned something. Do you follow what I'm getting at here? Okay. When you lift the way that most people lift, you do not have that feedback. It's essentially what's happening is that sooner or later that bar is going to beat you, and you just don't know when. On the other hand, if you are timing your lifts, and by the way, this system is dependent on technology. I don't know how to get past that. You have to start from the ideal and then make it practical. So you do need to have technology. The unit I'm using right here, and this is not a commercial endorsement, and I'm still looking at other units, but I'm using something called a Fitrodyne, which is available through a gentleman by the name of Professor Dusan Hamar from Slovakia. Interesting story. I brought this unit to a seminar last weekend, and it looks exactly like a pipe bomb, actually. It's like a metal, a cylindrical piece of metal with all sorts of wires and a clock on it. And incidentally had no problems whatsoever taking that through baggage, and no one had any interest in looking at that at all. But in any event, this unit is $650 US, which I guess what would that be? 29,000 Canadian. Yes?
Were you on the connecting flight to 587 by any chance?
No, not at all. But it's amazing how it was amazing how suspicious this device actually looks. You know. Okay, and what the Fitrodine does, incidentally, is it gives you mean power in watts and it gives you mean speed in meters per second. So it's just a little unit, not much bigger than this. You put it on the floor under the bar. There is a spool. There is a cord that goes up to the bar, and so you're getting mean power and mean speed for each concentric rep. Do you follow? Now, what happens is that I'll give you a protocol for this so that you can visualize how this works. Generally, what I will do is I will have an athlete. This is a maximal strength, speed strength type application. We'll have an athlete take a weight that represents approximately 80 to 90% of their 1 rep max. And we start doing sets of 1 after an appropriate warm-up. Now, what happens is that all of my athletes have a PR for their time for any given load, as well as a 1 rep max PR, personal record. So what happens is that you're always trying to beat your best possible time for any given load. And so, you know, if you find your time starting to decline set by set by set, what happens is that you start thinking of strategies. So, for example, if you're doing a bench press, you start remembering things like maybe retracting your shoulder blades or getting a better arch or whatever the little things are that you can do biomechanically. And then all of a sudden, now you get a better speed. So now you have feedback. Very important. I can't imagine doing resistance training at this point in my career without having that kind of feedback. Yes?
Does the Fitrodine calculate the peak?
No, no.
That's the only one, that must be the one that Lauren Goldenberg has from
No, that's a different device also. And, you know, one of the issues when you use technology like this, in my mind, is the practicality. And from talking with Lauren, there are practicality issues with that piece of equipment. I'm not sure. What's really nice about the Fitrodine is you just set it up. It works off a battery. It's instantaneous. It does not disrupt what you're doing. It's a handheld unit. So the practicality issue is important. I don't have a number, but I'll tell you what, if my email is Staley, S-T-A-L-E-Y, at myodynamics.com. And if you want to send me an email, I'll get you the information for this. It's the least expensive unit of this type that I'm aware of. Okay, so another example in terms of feedback. How many people have heard that if you do a vertical jump immediately before a heavy squat that you'll get better power output? I mean, I've heard this all the time. Interestingly enough, a couple of months ago, I had an athlete doing 90% singles on a barbell squat. And set by set by set, the power is doing this. And it's going a little down, 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 down. 10th set, we do a vertical jump. He gets the best score of any set that he did. Feedback. You find out what works. Important. In my way of thinking, every time you touch a bar, there should not only be a training effect, but there should be the possibility of feedback, and also you should be able to be testing. Okay? Another benefit of cutting off quality, and if I didn't mention, the basic protocol is that I've been using for about 9 months now, is that you cut off all repetitions that are less than 90% of your best speed for any given load. Follow what I mean? So if you've got an 85% load, for example, and your lifetime best concentric speed for that load is 1.2 seconds, then what you want is you don't want anything slower than, I think it's 1.32 seconds. That's the concept here. In other words, we want to keep this to a high level of quality. There is an enormous psychological difference between focusing on speed and focusing on load. And it's something that you have to do to fully appreciate this. But the difference is this. If the focus is on load, kind of a funny thing, load is both literally and figuratively depressing. Do you follow? And whereas speed is literally and figuratively uplifting. So normally when you're doing heavy singles on a barbell, there is psychological stress of sort of getting yourself up for that weight. When the focus is on speed, something very interesting happens. Whether or not you're going to lift the weight is a foregone conclusion. There is no stress about whether or not you're going to get that weight. It is simply, how am I going to beat my best speed for that weight? So from a psychological perspective, it's much less stressful. Okay. Another benefit here is that, at least in theory and in my experience of using this over the past 9 months, the possibility of overtraining is dramatically minimized. If you're capable of a 400-pound back squat, and in other words, the best back squat you've ever performed is 400 pounds, you come into the gym capable on one particular given day of 390 pounds, would you say that your body is in a trainable state? If you can do 390, 395, is your body in a trainable state for that lift at that time? Does it indicate that you're recovered and receptive to another workout stimulus? I would say yes. Okay? What happens if on another day you come in, your lifetime best squat is 400, you come in, and for whatever reason, you're only capable of 350? What does that make you think? Should you train that lift at that moment? I think not. I think it shows that your body is not responsive to that load at that time. All right? The reason that overtraining is dramatically minimized when you focus on keeping your speed at least 90% of maximum is, for example, here's the protocol. You take 80 to 85% of 1 rep max and you do singles, timed singles, until one of 3 things happens. Until A, you make 10 singles, or B, you experience pain, which is not something that should happen, but obviously you should not be training in pain, or until three, you get 3 strikes. In other words, you get 3 singles that are below 90% of your best speed for that lift. Do you follow so far? All right. So let's say on one given day you make it to 10 sets of 1 repetition without going below 90% of your best speed. That's a successful workout. In my way of training people, if you do that, then you increase the load for the next workout. However, let's say you repeat that workout the next week, and let's just say for some unknown reason, you can only manage 5 singles before slowing down. So what has happened now is the system has given you a light day. In other words, the system has given you an optimal load for that region of your body, for that motor quality, for that day. Or another thing that can happen is, let's say, whatever, you're catching a cold, you're jet lagged, you don't really need to know the reason, but let's say you come in and you are slow right from the start. The system just gave you your off day. Your body is not responsive to training at that particular point in time, at least for that region of the body and that motor quality. I mean, fatigue is specific. So just because you can't complete one task to satisfaction doesn't mean that you can't complete another task. Okay? Make sense? Questions? Paul?
Charles, if your load is getting lower, I mean, you're always working below 82 to 85% of your 1RM, would you be scared of a shift in your fiber?
Well, you might be misunderstanding. I mean, we will use loads close to maximal when maximal strength is the goal. So sometimes when I describe this system, people have the idea that everything is always fast or everything is always at submaximal loads. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, you might be doing, for example, 95 or 97.5% of 1 rep max for singles, in which case you wouldn't reach 10. But in any event, that load is lifted slowly because of the mass. But nevertheless, whatever your best time is for that particular weight, I still want you to be within 90% of your best speed for that weight, which might be slow, but obviously you're moving it as fast as you can.
You need intention.
The intention, correct. But I want more than intention. I want you to be able to do it. Because if you're taking 95, 97% for a single, and you're only capable of 75% of your best speed, to me that is a poor cost-to-benefit ratio. To me, you're tearing yourself down too much in relation to what good that single is doing for you. Okay? Somebody else had a question?
When you say on your bad days, how do you know if it's not more mental than than your actual body?
Well, great question, and I should be repeating the questions. The question is, how would you know if you're having an off day if it's not simply a mental or psychological type problem? I don't know, and I'm also not a psychologist, so it's outside the scope of my responsibility. But the point of it is that whether it's mental, psychological, physical, or otherwise, the person is not capable of performing that task to satisfaction, so therefore I don't want him to do it. Think about it this way. If you are training a cyclist for a particular given distance and he has a goal, you have to ask yourself, there's a certain pace that's required in order to cycle a certain distance at a certain time. In other words, revolutions per second, for example. So the question is, how much does that pace drop? How much are you going to allow that pace to drop before it's not worthwhile any longer? Does that make sense? I mean, the answer is not really a whole lot. So my approach in resistance training is exactly the same. Yes?
How do you determine benchmark speed? When you're testing a 1 rep max, what do you do? Any similar technique to determine your personal record?
The question is, how do you determine benchmark speed on lifts? In other words, how do you arrive at your personal record time for any given weight? It's just through training. So that every time you touch a bar, we know what your speed is. So every time that you better your best speed for a given load, then that's your new PR, and then your 90% is off of that new PR.
And on a bad day, if you came in at your first lift after warm-up was 80%, that's first, how many do you give it? 3 strikes, right?
I would give it 3 strikes in case it's a fluke. You follow? I mean, sometimes you might have inadequate warm-up. It could be a fluke. I mean, everybody has a bad rep here and there, so that's why I go 3 strikes instead of 1 or 2. Okay. All right. Question? No? Okay. Questions on this? Yes. I'm sorry, I'm a little blinded.
Why speed as a feedback mechanism? Why, maybe why not load or mental focus, or why?
The question is, why using speed? Why use speed as a feedback mechanism? Going back to the analogy that we used before, if you take a set to failure, because your speed deteriorates first, and then you break down technically, and then if you continue, you hit momentary muscular failure. Because of that progression, you have to use speed as the benchmark. Does that make sense? You follow? Okay. For example, and I've tested this many times on athletes. If you take a set to technical breakdown or just before technical breakdown, most people before they hit technical breakdown, their speed is down to about 40% of their best effort. Okay. So there was one other person who had a question over here. Yes, Scott.
Obviously, with the equipment that you have, singles and like squats, benches,
Yes.
chins, what are the other exercises that you can use the device with?
The question is, can this device or can this methodology be used for all lifts or just certain lifts? This particular device that I'm using can be used on almost anything, but obviously it is difficult to measure speed on small range of motion movements, calf raises and curls and things. As it turns out, it's fine because those are small muscle groups anyway. They don't take a big toll on your total recovery ability. So conveniently enough, it turns out to be okay from my point of view. Yes?
Yeah, could this method of training be extended to a multi-rep set?
Yes, it can. Now, this particular system is not necessarily in its final form, and I don't think it ever should be, and I think that we're all always evolving in terms of what we're doing. But yes, the system can be used for multi-repetition sets. The question is, how do you determine cutoff? What I'm doing right now is, for instance, if you do a set of 5, what we do is we average the mean power in watts, and we go off an average. So if you average a concentric power output, let's say, of 560 watts, then that's the number that we go off of. That's what I'm doing currently. That's not to say there might not be a better way to approach that, but currently that's what I'm doing. Yes, Paul?
Because I walked in late.
Sure.
Are you discussing a specific phase of conditioning right now?
In all phases of conditioning.
So you're doing this all through all phases?
Yes. I mean, assuming, and the pre-qualification, something that you will appreciate is the athlete has to be healthy, and the athlete has to have a training base. So for a novice, you have to, obviously establish your technique, and this is not something for somebody who's in rehab and so forth.
My concern is, though, what are you doing for, because this is about martial arts and things, right?
This is something that I use on most athletes, but martial artists, yes.
Okay, so in a combative athletic situation, so we take boxing, martial arts, grappling, whatever you want, many instances you're having to perform in a state of your body's flooded with lactic acid.
Yep.
So you're physically incapable of moving at those kinds of speeds. My concern with what you're presenting is that these athletes are not learning to perform, they're not learning to develop their motor system in an environment realistic to the competitive environment.
Sure.
Because it's a theoretically idealistic environment to think you're actually going to be able to move that fast all the time. I mean, I spent a lot of my life in boxing, I can tell you that that's not how it is.
You bet.
So how do you accommodate for that?
Well, first of all, I would say this. First of all, this is specific to developing certain motor qualities, and what you're referring to is strength endurance or speed strength endurance, which is actually speed strength endurance is the dominant motor quality for most martial artists. What I would simply say to that is that even if your primary goal in terms of motor qualities are endurance development, I would still say that you still want to train to perform at a high level of quality in the presence of fatigue. I mean, it may not be possible in actual competition, but that's my goal in terms of training. Do you follow?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that if this is the way you're training through all cycles, you become your environment. You become your training environment. So these people are going to be very fast for the first few rounds, but then they're going to be in trouble when they get tired because they're so used to taking breaks and waiting until they go fast or stopping when they're not going fast.
Sure.
And as the nervous system develops in an advanced athlete, you're capable of pushing them and training them to go fast in a, that's the definition of an elite athlete.
Yep. Well, my approach to that would be is that this is supplemental training, and these athletes are getting the experience that you're bringing up. I think that experience is being encountered in the ring or on the mat. So, I mean, I think that type of experience for an athlete, I wouldn't argue, I think is important, but I think that experience is being provided by your time on the mat or in the ring, is how I would put that. So, Paul.
Would you supplement it with a system of multi-contraction system like Jean Dedegat does in Switzerland? Example, he used to work with Werner Gaunter, world champion and shot putter for about 6 times. And he used to give him a lot of isometric followed by very fast concentrate and eccentric drop off. We use that a lot with our athletes.
Oh, sure. No, listen, I'm not. Sure. I mean, I certainly acknowledge the importance of eccentric and static contractions for fighters, no question about it. The system does not apply to that. I have not, it's difficult to measure power output in eccentric and static conditions. So those are certainly necessary experiences for athletes. It's something that this system does not apply to that successfully.
My question is, would you mix it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no question. One of the things that is sort of a hallmark with martial artists is that and actually athletes in general, but there is a focus on quantity over quality in many cases. And if you want examples of this in everyday life, if you imagine somebody who can do 5 pull-ups and they want to get themselves to the ability to be able to do, for example, 10 pull-ups, what is the method that most people will try to use to accomplish that? Yeah, every time you do a workout, you try to do an extra pull-up. So in other words, the focus is on quantity instead of quality. And those of us who are in the know and who are a little bit more refined in terms of strength training realize that the answer to solving that task generally is to use a higher level of quality. In other words, probably to use body weight plus extra load for maybe sets of 1 or 2, okay? Another thing that's really interesting is that during the last Olympic Games, Chevrolet had a commercial during the Olympic Games, and it was kind of interesting. They had like an athlete up on a mountaintop, and the music is playing and everything, and he's like, I don't know if you remember this, he's like cranking out, 47, 48, 49, and then they have somebody, cranking out push-ups, and it's like 41, 42, 43, and they had about 6 or 7 scenarios like that. And the message that you take home from this is that, the answer is in quantity and not quality. So there is sort of this psychology that fatigue is the goal of training. And I would actually take a little different look at this, and I would say that the goal of training is to perform at a high level in the face of fatigue, in the case of endurance, okay? You don't assess the effectiveness of training by how much fatigue it produces. I was on the forum of a popular website last week, and someone put a post like, how do I get my arms sore? I'm doing all these different techniques and strip sets and this and that and everything else, and I just want to make my arms sore. And I just wrote in, I said, well, why don't you just, have somebody drive over them with a car, I mean, if your goal is to just simply be sore, that's an easy thing to achieve. So to me, the value of training is not assessed by how much fatigue it produces, but instead by how well it improves the quality that you're trying to improve. Okay? So the thing that I'm trying to do generally in training is to manage fatigue and not create it.
Charles, would you use your system for unilateral movements?
A little bit harder for unilateral movements. You can still use it. Yeah, can still be used on unilateral movements by all means. Something that's interesting too in terms of longer-term planning strategies, or that I think it's really useful to use a lot of unilateral movements early in a phase in terms of just being able to have some kind of baseline assessment for strength, strength deficit left versus right. Okay, question?
Yeah, on different subjects, the lower body. Train athletes who've had, say, an injury, say, disc injury.
Sure.
How do you change your leg routine around to get that power speed without doing squats, plyometrics, or?
What I would do is that would be a consultation with whoever I'm working with in terms of a physical therapist or a soft tissue therapist, whoever the medical professional is in that situation, and we work out a strategy based on what that person finds. I think you bring up a good question, and I think it illustrates the importance of defining your boundaries as a professional in terms of what it is that you do and what it is that you don't do. So if we have if we have a relatively serious injury situation, then you've got to have the appropriate professional in there. And my goal, if I'm attending, for example, information that Paul is presenting or various sort of therapeutic type presentations, what I need to know is whether or not the situation is something that is beyond my capability. I mean, I have certain minimal capabilities in terms of soft tissue work and things like that, but I'm by no means a soft tissue therapist. I'm by no means a physical therapist. So it's important to know when something is in the scope of your responsibility or if it's not, okay? So I'm not evading your question, but this is something that you would come up with a decision based on whoever the medical professional is, yeah.
So you've seen you had to stay away from, say, particular squats with athletes?
I've had this happen many times. Yeah, particularly with people involved in jiu-jitsu. Is that what you were alluding to? It's very common to see high-level jiu-jitsu people who have basically no curvature in their lumbar spine. They're in a flexed position all the time. That's a very common thing to see. And I will tell you that I find myself using squats and deadlifts somewhat less with those athletes, or at the very least, you certainly have to have a higher level of caution with those types of people.
Plyometrics with them, to see if that compensates a little bit?
Really just depends on the situation whether or not you would use plyometrics. Depends also what the athlete is doing in their own training. I mean, I think it's really important to look at, what kinds of things are athletes experiencing in their own sport practice, and then being careful not to duplicate that in terms of supplementary training. I'll give you a great example of that. Grapplers who use gis, meaning your uniform tops, generally have really fried out wrist musculature, particularly like the pinky flexor and things like that. So I've seen recommendations a lot of times to do lots of forearm work with these kinds of athletes, but in my experience, it tends to be overload. So, yeah, Paul.
Just on that, because it takes us back to where you and I left off last time, and you just kind of opened the door to it again. I think there has to be an exception to that point if that is that athlete's weakness. In other words, if a guy cannot pull someone down because their grip gets too soon, then we got to be careful of not using the concept of, well, I don't need to do any training because I wrestle all the time.
Right. No, yeah, I fully agree. And another sort of way to look at that is that sometimes the weakness is maybe it's not a training issue, maybe it's a rehab issue. I mean, maybe it's gunked up tissue that can't move properly, and so. But I completely agree. It's something that would, if it's a weakness, it needs to be addressed, no question about it. So my whole thing is, if it's being addressed in training, then you move on to the next thing. If that weakness is not being addressed in training, it needs to be addressed, no question about it. So, okay, in terms of fatigue management, we talked about maintaining a 90% speed benchmark in terms of resistance training. A couple of other things that I find really useful. Fatigue accumulates over the course of a training session, correct? So, in my way of thinking, if you use standard rest intervals, in other words, if you always use 2-minute rest intervals or 3-minute rest intervals, the problem is that during early sets, you don't need as much rest as you need between late sets because fatigue is accumulating. So generally speaking, one way to go about this is to have the client perform all sets within a prescribed time limit. And then what happens is that instinctively the athlete will take shorter rests at the beginning in order to gain sort of a head start for sets later on. So that's something that I call front loading. Antagonistic pairing should be something that is familiar to most people. This is working, for example, lats against triceps, things like that. I've had a lot of success working with martial artists and looking at the antagonists. Kind of interesting. If you're trying to throw a fast punch, the mindset should not be on the extension but the retraction, if you follow. If you look at the muscles that are responsible for protecting the shoulder joint in a punch, you're looking at rotator cuff musculature and things like that, more so than perhaps the actual tricep and pectoralis. So it's in my experience, it's always been useful to really be looking at the antagonist that's involved in whatever it is that you're working with. Okay, avoiding redundancy. Redundancy is a great concept in aircraft design, not such a great concept in program design, in my way of thinking about this. I really, really favor a minimalist approach as opposed to sort of a cover all the bases approach, which is really a lot more common. I'm looking to try to get the most done with the least. Okay, and obviously prioritizing weaknesses in preparation. Clearly, if you look at Bompa's pyramid of physical preparation, technical preparation, tactical and psychological, one of the things that's really valuable to do is to see if you can assess, and you can actually give each level a numerical score to get some sense of where they are best prepared and worst prepared in terms of that. And then on each level, for example, on physical preparation, you can look at all the motor qualities that are involved, and you can actually, as an exercise, rank those motor qualities, and then, on so on and so forth. And what you do is you put the most time into things that are weakest. This is one of the primary formats that I use in terms of resistance training. And what this is lower body. Basically, I'm dividing the body into two regions, lower body, upper body. And in this case, I've got maximal strength and speed strength as motor qualities. But basically, for sake of simplicity, you can just have quality 1 and quality 2, But the point of this is that we're going lower body maximal strength, followed by lower body speed strength, followed by upper body maximal strength, followed by upper body speed strength. And in my experience, over the past 9 or 10 months, if you keep all the core lifts to 90% of your best possible speed, these first 2 workouts can be done in the space of 1 day. Okay, the second workouts are done in the space of the second day. The third day is kind of a rehab or a prehab day where you're going after those sorts of things, and then you repeat that whole thing over again. So for example, Monday is lower body, two sessions. Tuesday is 2 sessions for upper body. Wednesday is the prehab day. And then Thursday you go back to lower body, Friday upper body, and so forth. Okay? So there are a couple of different formats that I use, but that is one of the primary ones. Something that's very interesting too, you can actually go, we think of maximal strength as being, for example, foundational to speed strength. And I have no qualm with that whatsoever. But what's really interesting is that if you take a weight that starts out being 90% of maximum, and you over time learn to increase your ability to move that weight with more and more speed, what happens is that in the first phase where you're training maximal strength, that weight is 90%. And then as you get into the speed strength phase, by that point, that weight is now 78%, which is an appropriate load for speed strength training. So interestingly enough, you can actually use the same load for both motor qualities by virtue of the fact that you can now move that load faster. Okay? This is a key thing when you're training martial artists and fighters. Certain training elements are predictable and controllable. Other elements are not predictable and not controllable. Okay. Different ways to split your training here. A lot of times what you see is people doing martial arts training on Monday, resistance training on Tuesday, so forth and so on. The problem with that kind of approach is that you may incur an injury in the course of your martial arts training, or you may induce some type of fatigue that puts you at risk in terms of resistance training, and vice versa. So what I want to do is I want to prioritize the least predictable training element. For example, I don't want the martial arts session to follow the resistance training session. In other words, another way to look at this is every kind of training you do leaves a fatigue wake, so to speak. So I don't want to do martial arts training in the wake of resistance training fatigue. And the reason is that when you're on the mat with an opponent, you cannot modify your martial arts training to account for whatever happened in the resistance training session. You follow? In other words, you might be resistance training and let's say you strain a pec or something. You then are on the mat with an opponent, and there's no way that you can modify the martial arts session to account for that. If you flip that around and have the resistance training session done in the fatigue wake of the martial arts session, then the resistance training, which is a more controllable training element, is easier to modify. Okay? So that's something that I found to be useful over time. Moving on to, this is something, I just wanted to talk about this concept of using elastic resistance. This is something that's been around for decades, was made popular by Louis Simmons of Westside Barbell over the past, I would say, 10 years. And what you're basically doing is you're taking a constant resistance situation. You've got a barbell, and you are tethering that barbell to the ground by means of elastic resistance. This does a couple of things that are really interesting. First of all, you are getting a higher response from the nervous system, but perhaps more interestingly, 2 things are going on. The first thing is that you are creating the most force at the final stages of extension, where as a puncher, that's where you need that force to occur. And the second thing that happens that's very interesting is that when your shoulder joint is in its most vulnerable position, you have a lesser amount of stress instead of a larger amount of stress. So this is something that, for strikers, I found to really be a useful thing to do. Another application of this is to use chains instead of elastic. And the 2 modalities actually have a different feel to them, so it's worth looking at. This can also be used for squatting, any kind of compound lift. Okay. Another way to accomplish the same kind of a thing is to take a slightly smaller range of motion. In other words, you bench press down to a towel rolled up on the chest, or you bench press down to boards on the chest, that kind of a thing, because you want the accentuated portion to be at fuller extension. Okay? Yes?
And back to your schedule you had.
Yes.
That still goes, there's still a back and forth. I know I've played around with it for years with martial artists and myself as far as which one is better for your speed, which one is better for your power. You train the same day, your weightlifting, keep your speed, and then do your martial arts right after that, keep the coordination of the skills.
Sure.
Or you separate the days. And I found it's really hard, even though you switch back and forth.
Yeah.
Watching students and watching patients and watching myself, that they still kind contrast each other. It all goes about training around your injuries more or less.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I also think that program management is always a matter of managing compromise in all cases. But if, for example, if the martial arts session is Monday night, then what I'm looking for in most cases is to have the resistance training session Tuesday early, okay, as opposed to the reverse.
Just to keep your speed better, save your hands, if you do it the same day as what you're saying.
Well, my first concern is injury prevention, and my second concern is performance enhancement. So that's one of my core principles as a practitioner. So although we might be compromising the strength benefit because you are doing the resistance training in a fatigue state, I still want to have the controllable element second. So that if you are kind of tweaked from something you did on the mat or in the ring, that you can, it's easier to modify the resistance training session to account for that than the reverse. And you know, this is not like the ultimate law, but I'm just saying that this is, over time, what I've found to be the most doable kind of situation. Paul?
I was just going to say, a simple formula that I follow that sort of solves it all is just training from the most to the least neurologically demanding activity.
Sure,
That
sure.
way you're always getting the best quality for the nervous system at any given time relative to the task.
Sure,
If
sure.
you break that rule, you're going to break the athlete, period.
Yeah, I would have no argument with that at all. So, questions on anything? Yes?
With your particularly in reference to judo and jiu-jitsu and those types of arts, how would you account for the eccentrics, the isometrics involved in those sports outside of the ring? Would you do any
Outside of the ring?
Would you do any supplementary training?
Yes.
Sure. In most cases, yes. I mean, it's a highly individual question, but in many cases, yes. I mean, you know, and I keep going back to this, but you really need to look at what types of resistances are being encountered in training. And so if you have a motor quality that needs to be developed, but because you're not encountering the appropriate types of resistances in training, then that is your indicator for a need for supplementary training. So, yeah, I would absolutely use that. And, for example, eccentric training has therapeutic purposes for tendonitis, as an example. So that would be, and so it's not always a performance enhancement type situation. Sometimes it's a rehab or a therapeutic type question, but you bet. And I mean, obviously for grapplers, there's a great need for static strength. You know, if it's being supplied in terms of training, then great. If it's a weakness and it's not being addressed through training, then that's where you need the supplementary training, from my point of view. So, yeah. Questions? Further questions? Nothing at all. Okay, I'll tell you what, I will be available outside for a little bit if anybody has anything else that they want to address. But in any event, thank you very much, and we'll see you later.